they almost never talked about the war. Not because they were told not to, not because they were afraid of the memories. They didn't talk because for them, talking had stopped being necessary a long time ago, long before they came home, long before the uniform was folded away, long before anyone called them veterans. The habit of silence was learned inside a steel box, rolling across foreign ground, where every word had a cost, and every mistake belonged to everyone. Most people think silence means something is wrong, but inside an American tank during the war, silence meant something was working. Before we go deeper, let me make you a promise. By the end of this video, you will understand why so many American tank crewmen came back quiet. You will understand why their wives noticed it first, why their children asked questions years later, and why that silence was not a weakness, but a skill. Keep one question with you as you listen. If a tank taught men to survive without words, what happens when those men return to a world that never stops talking? To understand that, you need to understand the tank itself, not the machine you see in documentaries, but the space the crew actually lived in. American tanks like the M4 Sherman were not built for comfort. They were built for reliability, speed of repair, and mass production. That mattered because the American strategy was not to build the biggest or most intimidating tank. It was to build one that could be maintained by ordinary men, under pressure, with limited tools, and kept moving. That philosophy shaped everything inside. Inside a Sherman, space was counted in inches. Crewmen memorized where their knees could rest, where their elbows could move, where their shoulders had to stay. You didn't sit. You occupied a position, and once you occupied it, you stayed there, for hours, sometimes for entire days. Now compare that to civilian life. At home, if you felt uncomfortable, you stood up. You walked around. You stretched. Inside a tank, discomfort was constant. You didn't escape it. You adapted to it. And adaptation, repeated long enough, becomes habit. One of the first habits tank crews learned was economy of movement. Every motion had to mean something. Wasted movement caused fatigue. Fatigue caused mistakes. Mistakes affected everyone. So men learned to move only when necessary. They learned how to pass tools without looking, how to shift weight without bumping another man, how to anticipate movement before it happened. Words work the same way. Early on, new crewmen talked too much. They asked questions. They narrated what they were doing. Veterans corrected them gently at first, then firmly. Inside a tank, you didn't announce every action. You trusted the man next to you to know what to do. And when trust replaces explanation, silence naturally follows. This is a critical point most people miss. Silence inside a tank was not emotional withdrawal. It was coordination. Over time, the crew developed rhythms that were almost invisible. The driver adjusted speed without being told. The gunner made small corrections based on instinct, not discussion. The loader moved when the moment arrived, not when someone asked. The commander watched, listened, and spoke only when words added value. That silence saved energy. It saved focus. It saved lives. Now, here's where the psychological shift happened. When you live in a space where silence equals safety, your nervous system rewires itself. Noise becomes something you evaluate. You stop reacting automatically. You listen first. That habit doesn't disappear just because the war ends. This is why so many tank veterans came home and found modern life overwhelming in subtle ways. The radio, the television, multiple conversations at once. People talking just to fill space. None of it felt dangerous, but all of it felt unnecessary. At home, silence had a different meaning. Silence made people uncomfortable. Silence meant something was wrong. So, when a veteran sat quietly at the table, Families assumed he was distant or troubled. In reality, he was often just resting in a familiar state, a state where nothing demanded immediate reaction. Letters reveal this better than interviews ever could. Tank crew letters were usually practical, short, grounded. They talked about food, weather, sleep, and routine. Rarely emotion, rarely fear, rarely detail, not because those things weren't present, but because focusing on the concrete kept the mind stable. Here's a curiosity many people don't know. Tank crews often memorized parts of letters before mailing them, because they didn't always have time or space to reread them. Writing itself was an act of control, a reminder that there was a world outside the steel walls. But once written, the letter was folded away, and the crew returned to silence. Now, let's make a comparison that will stick with you. In civilian life, trust is built through conversation. You talk things out. You explain yourself. You reassure. Inside a tank, trust was built through consistency. You showed up. You performed. You didn't panic. You didn't hesitate. Over time, that kind of trust runs deeper than words ever could. That's why, years later, when tank crewmen reunited, they didn't need to catch up the way others did. They didn't ask, "How have you been?" They watched posture, they noticed habits, they listened to tone. Silence still carried information. This leads us to another overlooked truth. Many tank veterans didn't feel the need to process the war verbally because they had already processed it operationally. Their minds learned to handle stress through action, not narration. This is where popular culture gets it wrong. Movies teach us that healing requires talking, and for some people that's true. But for many tank crewmen, healing came from rebuilding normal life with the same discipline that kept them alive: work, routine, family. Fixing what was broken, showing up every day. They didn't come home looking for meaning. They brought meaning with them. Let's talk about habits that followed them home. Many tank veterans hated clutter. Inside a tank, clutter was dangerous. At home, clutter felt wrong. Tools were kept clean. Workspaces were organized. Things had places. This wasn't obsession. It was conditioning. They also hated wasted motion. Slamming doors, unnecessary gestures, loud arguments. These things felt inefficient. So they avoided them. They spoke when something needed to be said. Otherwise, they stayed quiet. Children noticed this later in life. They noticed their fathers didn't raise their voices. They noticed instructions were short, clear, non-negotiable. The tank taught men how to lead without noise. And here's the loop we've been building toward. If silence protected them inside the tank, what was it protecting at home? It was protecting stability. These men understood something deeply. Chaos grows when discipline disappears. So they kept discipline alive in small ways. Fixed schedules, predictable routines, calm responses. They weren't trying to relive the war. They were trying to prevent disorder. That's patriotism most people don't recognize. Not flags, not speeches, but responsibility. Now think about this for a moment. How many times have you heard someone say, "My grandfather never talked about the war"? And how often was that followed by confusion or frustration? Rarely is it followed by understanding. That silence was not avoidance. It was a boundary. Inside the tank, boundaries saved lives. Outside the tank, they protected families. When these men aged, the silence softened but never disappeared. Some spoke a little more. Some never did. But the pattern remained. And when they passed away, families were left with questions. This video answers one of them. They didn't speak because silence had already taught them everything they needed to know about trust, duty, and restraint. And now we close the final loop. At the beginning, I asked you to hold one question. If silence protected them during the war, what was it protecting afterward? It was protecting peace, not the kind written in history books, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in kitchens, garages, and porches, the kind built by men who learned inside a steel box that words are powerful, but discipline is stronger. They never spoke about it, and because of that, their legacy endures. This is Stories of Honor, letters, memories, legacy. If someone in your family came back quiet, this story belongs to them.